Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Getty Museum Art Break. Don't judge designing book covers. My name is Larissa Grolemond. I'm an assistant curator of manuscripts here at the Getty Museum, and really pleased to welcome you all to this conversation with Charlotte Strick. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Closed captioning has been enabled, and to access live captioning, just click the CC icon on your Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. Also, please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask questions as we move through the program. There will be some time to address questions throughout the program as well as at the end of the conversation. So anything that occurs to you, please pop it in the Q&A. This conversation complements an exhibition that's currently on view at the Getty Museum, at the Getty Center through January 28th. So you still have plenty of time to see it. Graphic design in the Middle Ages, curated by myself and co-curator Sam Truman. So just by way of introduction, this show delves into the idea that medieval books were produced with an eye toward design, that artists and scribes thought carefully about how the arrangement of text and image on and across pages and throughout books could influence the reading and understanding of the book's contents. So I'm just showing you a few examples here from the exhibition of how medieval artists and scribes thought about the arrangement of text and image on the page, and how that design could influence reading. And similarly, the idea of what we would call typography or font selection was also really important for medieval books, though, of course, handmade books were written out manually by specially trained scribes. And the selection of text type was not accidental. Decorative calligraphy and letter forms were a deliberate design choice tailored to the kind of book and its intended readers and the interpretation of the text within. And finally, just briefly to consider the role of ornament, which played such a central role in medieval book design, helping to not only organize the text in really logical ways and facilitating a reader's moves through a book, but also to surprise and aesthetically delight. So today I'd like to think about a staple of modern book design, the cover, which is of course absent from most medieval books, but is a hallmark of the way that we understand and interact with books today. Don't judge a book by its cover is, of course, a familiar adage, though we frequently and almost inescapably do judge books this way. And here to join me to discuss how the design features of this ubiquitous but powerful aspect of modern books influence why we're drawn to some and maybe not to others is Charlotte Strick, co-founder of Strick and Williams and an expert on book design and cover design in all its facets. So I'll now invite Charlotte to join me. Charlotte, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about book covers with me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Larissa. This is really a treat. And thank you to everybody who decided to spend this hour with us. I appreciate
Absolutely.
the Getty thinking to include me in this conversation. It's really an honor.
Well, I think, in our pre-conversations, we talked a lot about why we're drawn to certain book covers and not others. And it has so much to do with the way they look, of course, and those kind of almost intangible elements of design that we're not necessarily conscious of, but really, really influence the way that we understand the books that we pick up. Um, so I think I will first like to just ask you, what's your background? How did you get into book covers, and why do you love them so much?
Fine question. Well, it's definitely one of my favorite topics. My father was a book publisher, and so books long been part of my life. We always read at night, and I still do that with my kids who are verging on 13. Um, I remember from a really young age being curious about why sometimes the covers and the interiors didn't match. And I remember asking that question of my dad. I can't remember his answer, but it annoyed me. And there's perfectly good reasons that I've discovered over the years. But the curiosity was there early on, and as was a love of typography.
Mhm.
My dad also had a business selling artist material trade supplies. So we often had people who were visiting us from overseas, artists or craftsmen, calligraphers, talking and listening to conversations about ink and special paint colors that weren't available overseas or that my dad was carrying here. And so there was appreciation for craftsmanship for sure, and a
Mhm.
love of letter form, and um, so people will laugh about how excited I can get over a typeface. So I
I
guess
totally
I guess I guess
understand.
it's your DNA, but I know that you could appreciate
Totally
that.
understand. I mean, I think what's so fascinating for me about book covers is that we really have an emotional response to them, but that's really elicited by the design. And I think something that I think about a lot is the physical book and the way that covers can sort of be of course, the introduction to a book, but can really be the gateway into the interior of a book. And so, as you
Mhm.
say, making the cover match the text in a way is a real challenge. So I've just opened the slide onto one example. I'm wondering if you can maybe use this as an opportunity to just talk us through your process when you approach a new book cover. I assume you read the book before designing the cover, but can you talk us through a little bit the design process and kind of the thinking around making that cover match the interior of the book?
Of course, of course. So that is, I think, the number one question that book jacket designers are asked. Any of my colleagues listening in are probably laughing, in agreement, I hope. Um, the very first slide or image on the upper left, is the very first book I designed for Lydia Davis, who is a really important author for R. Strauss and Giroux, the book publisher I worked for 14 years in-house as a jacket designer. And I was still a young designer at the time. I was very excited to get the assignment. And I went through rounds and rounds of covers. And yes, I did read this book, and it was a great introduction to the way Lydia writes. And anybody familiar with Lydia's work knows that she is known for her stories, and there are stories that are only one sentence long. So after many, many rounds of trying to figure out how to package this book, and learning the vocabulary of an author, which is really kind of what you do as a jacket designer, um, and being sent back to the drawing board, I thought I felt frozen. Sometimes when the writing is so good and you haven't hit it a few times, you think, I'm never gonna pull this off. I'm never gonna pull this off, but you don't want to give it up either. So I did something that I still do today, which is, if things aren't going right, I try to get back into the manuscript itself. And because the answers are all within the writing. And if you can open yourself back up to that, you can start having fresh ideas.
Mm.
So in the case of this book, I flipped to a page as I was trying to breathe normally, looking at my timeline and when I needed to deliver it. And I landed on a story, which I should have bookmarked here, but to paraphrase, Lydia says, fly landed on my my writing or my notebook and created a punctuation or
Mm.
something to that effect. I'm sure she did
Mhm.
it far better than I. So it was like a eureka moment, and I had this idea that we could do something highly conceptual. So if viewers can tell, it's a bit hard to read Lydia's name. I have the book with me, and maybe it's a very gloomy here in New York today, but um, we put a spot glass on it, so when it catches the light, you can read the words, and there is a little bit of tone behind it, but really it's when you approach it, you might just see a fly on a blank sheet. And Lydia completely appreciated that, because it was really speaking the same language as
Mhm.
her writing. And as an aside, when the books arrived in a box to FSG, the operations manager told me she thought they had been infested with flies. So
Oh
she was
gosh.
wildly swatting at the books, which I consider a career highlight. So
Mhm.
anyway, um, then from there, I went on to design other books by Lydia Davis, and the collected stories. This is the paperback, that beautiful salmony orange colored one. And you were talking about the tactile nature of books, and
Mm.
these are printed on laid paper, which is a sort of old fashioned paper that even even uncoated paper stocks used by publishers often don't make use of laid. It has a like a fine line, horizontal or vertical. You can run it either way if you want to be controversial,
Mhm.
and suddenly controversial. Um, and it became such a sort of successful brand in a way for her that it was carried through to the backlist. In fact, Varieties of Disturbance, the Fly book, ended up getting repackaged as a solid color with a hand drawn frame and using Futura
Mhm.
black, which is what this typeface is, as a way to kind of create almost like a book plate effect.
Mhm. So both, I
Um,
mean, these examples are both using texture in a way, like you really need to, or and in the case of Varieties of Disturbance, that you need to kind of hold the book
yeah.
and look at it from a few different angles. And so there's a real kind of invitation to pick up that's created by the cover design. I really appreciate that as a medievalist who likes texture.
Well, I appreciate that as a jacket designer who, hopes that print will stay alive a
Hmm.
bit longer. Because, of course, there are opportunities for digital covers too, in ways, that print covers can't pick up,
Hmm.
at least yet. You can have elements move around in an animation to sell
Hmm.
a book, and you
But
can
you
have
lose that
surprises
kind of
appear. But if you're a tactile person,
you lose that kind of handmade
yeah.
or sort of like invitation to leaf through or to examine from a few different angles. Does the jacket design change between a hardcover and a paperback usually, or is there kind of a desire for continuity usually across those forms?
Well, it really depends on the publisher
Hmm.
and the audience um, they're trying to attract. If a book, say, didn't do well in hardcover, but there's no real apparent reason,
Hmm.
um, it's another opportunity to get the book out into the world.
Hmm.
And so, it's a great way to think, okay, well, the paperback audience is often different from the hardcover audience, and price point, and also the kinds of people who might be carrying a book around with them versus a person who's enjoying a book in their living room in their armchair.
Hmm.
So at least when I first started designing books in-house, there was a lot of conversation about how younger people are typically the buyers for paperbacks. And so the cover might respond to that. um, if a book has done exceedingly well, on the flip side, there might be a really good, compelling reason to keep the cover the same, just so that, their audience is seeing the same cover um, really over kind of a 2-year stretch where they might be like, oh, I've got to read that book. I need to pick it up, and
Hmm.
it's not, they don't have to um, have that moment of wonder, like, is this the same book by the same author? I'm not sure, so
Right.
it really depends on what the goals are. The and to before we move on to the next slide, the last book here, I think, is the only example I've shared with you where there are a couple of killed covers included, and that just means covers that didn't make it to the end. Again, it was a collection of stories, and um, I was trying to figure out, having learned the lessons of spareness from
Hmm.
my other Davis designs, how could I bring that to this newest title? And there is the longest piece in this collection is a story of cows, and it's wonderful. And I wondered if the cow was a great stand-in for the title. And
Hmm.
titles are also really important to what we do, because they often also give us a route into the solution. Can't and won't, to me, I could picture lots of cows saying I can't and won't in a field where they were refusing to budge. And since Lydia, who's a great observer, was observing these cows across the field from where she was writing, I thought that she would understand that, and she did really appreciate them. And these were painted by an illustrator named, well, I'm trying to remember Ariana's married name now, Ariana Nemad. Um, she was trying to break into book design, and I saw that she had, I think, a bear in her portfolio, and I was like, I know you can draw a cow. So she gave me all these cows, which were wonderful, and I tried again to kind of create a book plate effect on the one that's mostly green,
Mhm.
shrinking the cows down to almost like a end paper effect. And then you can see where, we moved to different cows in different positions, eating the grass that was growing up from the type. And
Mhm.
then again, I went back to the drawing board and I thought about the title of the book and uh, the short story Can't and Won't, and thought about what is Lydia really saying here. And I thought, it doesn't really need an image at all.
Mhm.
So I added a period after her name, which made me happy. So it wasn't on the jacket brief from the editor, and she liked that. So
Mhm. But
that
you
was
did
a small success.
maintain the same sort of color scheme throughout, even to the final product. How much are authors and illustrators kind of in conversation with you about not just the typeface, but also the color and the lack of images or presence of images? Do you have that kind of collaborative conversation with them, or does it vary author to author?
Generally not directly. If you're working with a big publishing house,
Hmm.
that information will come to you via the art director who's hired you,
Right.
or if you're in-house, you'll be talking to the editor. But sometimes I shouldn't, it's not that's not always the case. In fact, with a job that's, it's not hitting, sometimes the editor will put the author in direct contact with you, and something can be gleaned just by virtue of not having so many people delivering the information.
Mhm.
So oftentimes you're dealing with people too who are words people and not visual people. And so, it's hard for editors, authors, publishers in some cases to respond to ideas designers have without actually seeing them first.
Mhm.
And so that can create a roadblock for us because, it can be a lot of work to try to show somebody a sketch, but in the end, it's a great way to get people on board for an idea, even if it means hiring an artist like Ariana in this case, um, to collaborate and just say, here are examples of other things they've done that are like what I'm imagining. And
Mhm.
here is what I hope we can do for your jacket.
Mhm.
Uh, and as for color, yeah, I always appreciate when somebody tells me, whatever you do, don't make it purple because I can't
Mhm.
stand purple. And then we have a whole long conversation about shades of purple because they might hate purple at this end of the spectrum, but be fine
Mhm.
with lilac. So and color is very subjective
Mhm.
to begin with. So
But
anyway,
so
that,
emotional too.
that's
I
it.
mean,
It is emotional.
yeah.
Yeah. You can't control what an audience is going to bring to anything that you put out there, whether you're a fine artist or commercial artist. But yeah,
Mhm.
um,
Should we maybe talk about
we
the
move
next
on.
one?
Yeah.
Let's see if I can get my there we go. So this one obviously has an entirely different vibe to it in a
Yes.
way,
Yeah.
and I think an interesting backstory. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how this one came into existence and kind of yeah, the play of text and image in this one especially because it really, I think, does an interesting thing with shapes and the kind of inclusion of text within the image, in a way that feels, important for the kind of overall, impact of it.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad you're feeling that way. This is just hit bookstores. So some people who are listening in or watching might recognize it from their bookstore windows. Um, this is a book by Alice Carrier, and she is the daughter of um, Jennifer Bartlett, whose work appears in small series of like gridded squares on the left
Mhm,
next to the doll parts. Um, because her mother was such an important figure in the art world, there were some early conversations, and we hadn't spoken to Alice directly, but my business partner, Claire Williams, and I discussed whether or not it made sense to, for some kind of homage. Um, Her mother used a lot of house references, and since it is a memoir of a childhood, a house, is a very clear symbol of what may or may not be broken from somebody's past. So and ultimately we moved away from that after working through lots of sketches. And doll, I included, when I sent you some kind of mood board images, I included the doll parts because Alice describes the kind of coming apart of herself in the book. And she is literally sort of unstitched by the adults around her, and rather than what we always hope for our children. So, and mental illness will do that to any of us. So we talked, so Claire and I visited those sorts of ideas of parts, and what it means to feel broken and be broken. And then of course, as you can see from Alice in the bottom left, she is healthy and well and a fantastic writer. We saw these images on Instagram and got really excited about them and wondered if there was a way to express the joy of, in the arc of her story, to talk about the joy that she now has in understanding who her parents are, looking back as an adult at her parents, understanding them as human beings, and, all of us being flawed. And this idea of kind of this taping back together of a life. Alice freely admits that she, there was a lot of self-harm when she was a teenager, and moments of crisis. And so whenever you're creating a jacket for a book that is so intense in nature, it can be very hard. You want to express the harder piece and the harder sides of a story, and while making the jacket inviting. And that's a complex puzzle, and a really interesting one from a design perspective. So it was, we were trying to figure out how could we suggest this passage of time, as people do with lines and crossing, and that endless kind of misery of depression, with this arc and this joy of Alice's life so far. So we buried her in this kind of mess of stripes and tape and bandages. And an early lesson I learned in art school was, any line, and I wonder if you see this in any of the medieval pieces too, because these are unspoken rules in some cases, but any kind of line or type that is sloping to the upper right corner, suggests a positive. You feel exuberant, you feel like, that you're leaping off the page. And so note how the type is kind of acting like flags in that way, and Alice's eye is looking up at them. So these are all things that designers think about, and we appreciate that people at the bookstore might not even realize, but that subliminal messaging hopefully makes them want to pick it up.
Well, that's what I find so interesting about something like this, which is so sort of sensitively tied to the interior of the book, the content of the text, but may read to someone just picking up the cover as maybe slightly abstract, or they're not sure why they respond to it, but they do kind of have that, as you say, subliminal reaction, or kind of visceral, kind of emotional sense of the contents of the book. And I wonder then, the covers then become a little bit of a way of discovering the text, that after you've read it, maybe you appreciate the cover in a different way. Um, how does your work kind of anticipate multiple readings, or maybe a return? Do you think about that when you're thinking about covers?
Do you mean for myself or for
Yeah,
reading?
yeah. I mean, maybe for yourself even when you're kind of, incorporating things that may read at first glance as an abstraction, but will encourage people to maybe come back to them. Like, how do you, how do you think about people maybe returning to the cover after they've
Mm.
read the book, if at all?
Well, there is a book on my bookshelf behind me, called The Smile in the Mind, and
Mhm.
it's one of the first books that we were told to purchase when I was a student at Parsons School of Design. And I love that title so much. Speaking of titles, and it really did a great job of expressing what I always innately wanted to achieve, even as a kid, making greeting cards for friends and family. And so I think that to me is, when you have the greatest success with design, sure, there are, gorgeous all type covers and beautiful, beautiful photographs, that I feel lucky to have been able to use, in conjunction with my typesetting. But when you can think a little bit more deeply and, access the story from a way that's maybe a little more clever without, um, alienating your audience, like not too smart perhaps, if that's, not appreciated. But one of the wonderful things about working at Farrar, Straus and Drew is the quality of the writing is that good,
Mhm,
and they really, applaud and kind of artist's approach to their covers. I was encouraged, even without really, there being much conversation, just encouraged to think as creatively as possible.
mhm,
And, the themes that we're always exploring are the same. There's it's themes that repeat in life, of course,
mhm,
birth, death, love, loss, um, shame, joy, illness, as we were just discussing. And so what makes each person's story different from another's,
mhm,
and how do you package that story in a way that feels honest and true,
mhm.
and new. You sort of, I don't I'm a observer of trends without trying to, have a magnifying glass everywhere. But,
Right.
you want your work to stay current, and even if you're repackaging, which I think is what we're going to talk about next, it's like
Mhm,
you might want to take, a novel that was written 50 years ago, and how do you give it a contemporary voice while still honoring the fact that it was written in another period
mhm,
where, at least, on the surface, things might have looked quite different.
mhm.
um,
We have one
so I do
beautiful
hope
cover
that
to
people
talk
go back.
about first.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I hope that people do go back and re-examine the cover, because there is gonna be that smile in the mind.
Yeah.
Oh, this slide is
So yeah, we have
yeah.
one. I appreciate that you included this visual material, because I think it does speak to, the relationship of the handmade to your work and the kind of, the illustrative quality that a lot of covers have that I think people are drawn to the visual aspect of them. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this, the collage aspect of this next cover.
Sure. And I know we've talked a lot already and we still have more slides to go. So I'll just quickly say, that these are three beautiful collages made by Billy Rankle, who is, a collage artist, based in Tennessee, where his sister, Margaret Rankle, the author of the book you're about to see, and I believe it hits bookstore shelves next week. This is it in progress.
Mhm,
Billy, and Margaret, I gather, have always sort of collaborated on her covers, and, they already obviously have been in conversation for years about how to package her work. And, so I came into it just having, kind of looked at the three images you saw are only a portion of the, collages he developed for the interior of the book. And there was, I don't know if you remember, but all the way to the left, there was a almost I don't know, to me, it seemed like 300 different shades of green all layered together. And I was so taken with it. I had said to him early on, I wonder if, we could build something like that. I don't know which season we would choose, but could we build something like that and bury the type inside it? And ultimately, the book is called The Comfort of Crows. And so I created this very simple, flat, kind of 2D crow shape to bury within his collage. And he hand cuts all of his papers. So whereas many artists today might do this all in Photoshop, the video on the right shows you a view from his studio. So you can really see how you can see the edges where a knife was cutting. And I wanted to include this one, not just because it's about to hit bookstore shelves, but also because of the nature of medieval books and artisans and how they worked, and their version of carpal tunnel. So I'm sure that it's rare to find somebody who is so invested in working by hand
Mhm,
in the commercial space still.
mhm,
And Billy is a fine artist, but he does have a foot in both camps, like a lot of artists.
mhm,
And he was terrific to work with. Once we worked out the shape, he actually printed it out in his studio and cut it out and placed it inside. And then I told him which leaves I was sorry weren't coming in front, or which should go back. And so we went back and forth on various little berries and branches. And then we had to work in this great quote from Ann Patchett, knowing that would help to sell the book.
mhm,
And so that's a case of marketing playing a role too, which is also important and we haven't touched on yet so
mhm.
much. So
This struck me as an example of something where you can, I think, feel the handmadeness of the collage kind of coming through even in the finished product. And it's such a again, this kind of invitation to pick up,
mm,
and the kind of the luminousness of the crow shape kind of against that, the colors of the collage, I think is so inviting in a way,
mhm,
and so lush visually. And so again, this was one that I was curious about, the interaction of text and image and the kind of like encapsulation of the text within the image,
mm,
and kind of how you balance that need to have the, I don't know, the title and the author on the cover with that kind of really lush image, and how does that process kind of work for you?
sure. That's such a great question. I think that all too often in commercial art, we often get really excited about working with an artist and the type becomes an afterthought.
Mhm.
So, and it really shows, it'll feel like the type is kind of, for lack of a better word, slapped
Yeah.
onto it. And sometimes you feel really bad and you want to not be shoehorning it in, but you have no choice.
Mhm.
Maybe the art was even given to you and you have to work with it. So how do you do that in a way that still feels artful? And in this case, my initial thought was to bury individual letters into when I look back at my doodles, I can see of individual letters hidden in the thicket of Billy's collage, which is a representation of Margaret's garden.
Mhm.
She's talking about her own garden here. And I just thought if we had a container shape that didn't impose on Billy's work, but was working in concert with it, that it would
Mhm.
be much, well, easier to read, actually, but also just more effective,
Mhm.
as though, this vessel that basically anything that has type on it has to sit kind of within a vessel that is separate but a part of. And so in that way you can kind of see the division between the graphic designer and the
Mhm.
fine artist in this case,
Mhm.
which I think works well because it really was a collaboration like that.
Mhm.
And there were different typefaces that I played around with within this shape, and I came to this calligraphic style, which has kind of come back into vogue, but was very popular mid-century. And but I like how some of the smaller type foundries are playing with that style of type and kind of giving it a contemporary 2023 voice.
Mhm.
So it's not Lydian, which is kind of classic for this style of type and very, very popular in book publishing of the 50s. And I've used on other covers. I've been trying to look for post Lydian fonts that do similar things. And I wish I could remember this font and the type foundry so I could call them out, but happy to answer it for anyone who wants to reach out to me. I think it does a beautiful job.
So I mean, sort of related to that, the
Yeah.
literal inclusion of text in a
Yeah.
cover. So we have this next one, which actually plays, and I really responded to this, I think, because I was thinking a lot about calligraphy and the role of calligraphy in medieval books and the role of decorative text. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of designing this next cover, and then this three-dimensional kind of text,
Mhm.
which is so also again really tactile, but really visually interesting as well.
Yeah, I love alphabets made out of all sorts of things, and I should clarify that none of this is my work. I pulled them as examples to just show you where the starting process was. So in reading this manuscript um, for a book called Threats, um, I was thinking about the storyline. It's a bit of a mystery, a dark mystery, and the protagonist has recently lost his wife, and he's suffering from amnesia and starts to find these very small pieces of paper hidden in his garden with threats on them that are, don't explain where they came from, who they're from, but you can imagine a recluse with amnesia putting all of that together and what that would do to somebody's mental state. So I wondered, again, actually, it's funny coming from the garden we were just looking at, how, how do we, how do I express this like discovery of messages?
Mhm.
And could I do that with the type? So the type would be telling part of that story. So um, I pulled these off the internet as just beautiful examples of somebody again with, well, the one on the left might be digital, or at least partially, but the other two look like they were cut with an X-Acto knife,
Mhm.
like Billy was working with. And I thought about, you know, legibility is obviously a big thing to contend with,
Mhm.
and so I wondered about a piece of paper that was rumpled, and so the stock photo on all the way to the right talks about, that process of writing a small note and like making it really even smaller and then burying it. And so I have twin boys, and before they went off to school they had a nanny while I was still, or going to work every day. And Fridays I worked from home when I wasn't at FSG, so I could spend more time with them. And when they were napping, I started working on designing this cover. And Sarah, our nanny, and I became very good friends during that period because she had plenty to teach me. But she was very, very confused by the next slide, which shows a casserole dish in my kitchen where I started to build this miniature garden for Amelia Gray's character. And it looks, I know, pretty ridiculous, but I had a vision. And I took paper and soaked it in tea and twisted it. And the idea was, in the way that I guess like earthworms start to come up after a rain, almost like the mystery had been revealed,
Mhm.
had kind of emerged from the soil. And I imagined that this guy probably didn't have much of a green thumb and had let the garden go to weeds. And so it made sense to just go to my city terrace and dig out of my own pots. And I remember it was fall, so I had, leftover buds that were drying up. But when I showed it in a jacket meeting, everybody got it, but they all felt it felt a little sad. And again, that, to revisit what we were talking about with Alice's book, how do you tell a story that might be a bit dark and intimidating to want to spend $18 on, in this
Mm,
paperback form. Even if you enjoy that kind of work, sometimes, the cover to something has to still be maybe brighter than the story inside. So I went back to my garden and plucked some flowers. Or there's a nice weed in the final on the right.
a little bit
So
of green, but it still
yeah, a
has
little bit
that
of
sort of
green, a little
like
bit of pink.
that
And then there
feeling
was a
of
lot of
being
Photoshop of like making
right.
I was watering it so that the dirt would be as dark as possible. So you'd have a high contrast. And
Right.
it's a lot
I
of
love
fun.
this though because it really is the combination of like the very handmade, like literally and hand constructed, with the digital, with the sort of like combination then of like design elements that then feel kind of at home with the handmade. And there's a good question from the audience, which was also a question of mine,
Yeah.
so I'll ask it.
Oh,
Um,
great.
it was it seems like there was a lot of work that is done physically, both with this example and then maybe with some of your other examples as well, kind of like before you
Yeah.
get to the digital
Mm.
kind of aspect of it. Is this common or is this more of your own artistic process? Is this how a lot of book designers work or is this just you?
Hmm. I don't know. You'd have to pull them. It's definitely how I work. I mean, I was a fine arts major undergrad,
Mhm.
and I worked in fashion for a few years before getting a degree in graphic design. Um, the what drew me to fashion is not dissimilar to what draws me to books. I love fabric and pattern and
Mhm.
color. And so I love the tactile nature of the garment industry. And I know that if I take the time to sketch something or really think about the materials, I'm gonna just arrive at a more interesting solution than
Mhm.
if I were to just start in Adobe and
Mhm.
start creating. Because it's for me, it's really easy to kind of lose my way. And, there is like any creative process, there's the excitement at the start and then that kind of like banging your head against the wall. Writers in the room will appreciate that. And then, with luck, you find your way out of that woods. If I start that process earlier by doodling and kind of mapping out where
Mhm.
elements might lay, or in this case, getting my hands really dirty. I didn't know if anyone was going to like this. Of course, I was asking a lot of everyone at FSG. This is a really prime example of them supporting, an unusual solution because of course the type is also on its side here, and that is another thing that's really hard to get through.
Mhm.
um when I say get through, I mean get approved.
Yeah.
So and
Well,
printed and actually on a bookstore shelf. So
right.
applause to Amelia Gray, the author, because she loved it and she fully supported it too. So
It also
um,
the dirt has such a tactile invitation to it in a way you kinda just wanna stick your fingers in.
it's not for everybody, but then not every book is for everybody
Yeah,
either.
exactly.
So so it's okay.
So we'll talk just I
Yeah.
think briefly about this last example, and if folks in the audience have any questions, I think we have just a few minutes for them. But this I think is a really interesting example of I think a question that I've had in my head, which is like, how do you pay homage or sort of acknowledge the history of a story while also making the cover feel really contemporary and really modern. And maybe you can talk through kind of the final product of this Towers of Trebizond, really fantastic ornamented elephant, and the kind of history of this cover.
Yeah, well, I just want to applaud uh, you and Greg and Getty for putting this on the invitation to this
Mhm.
talk because I thought it was very inspired combination of illuminated letters and Lindsay Mayer Bugh, who is the illustrator of this particular piece. Um, so in this case, I was the art director of the paperback line at FSG
Mhm.
for many years. And one of the great gifts of that role is the opportunity to revisit the backlist titles.
Mhm.
And those are books that were published years ago and remain these are the books that keep publishers in business if they sell well. They're perennials. They continue to print year after year, even if it's just a few copies. And so this had remained in print and had good enough numbers that um, they decided, maybe it's time we gave this a new face.
Mhm.
So when I got an assignment like that, I did my research, which is to kind of dig back in the history of a book.
Mhm.
And that's really useful for everybody because um, you can really understand, how styles have changed,
Mhm.
and also, um, what might be useful to either bring out in the recent, like maybe we love the type, but maybe the image isn't working, or vice versa. And then, there are trends, as we just talked about with typography, there are with illustration as well.
Mhm.
And, would any of those earlier editions give us a clue to what we might want to create? So the two covers on the bottom, the one on the right is by Milton Glaser, who our audience may know best from the I Love New York logo from the 70s. And the one on the right is Alvin Lustig, a great hero to many jacket designers. His cover for um, Towers for Meridian Books, which
Mhm.
was um, a paperback publisher who my dad actually had something to do with. So that was always fun to see that logo on a book. But that's the wonderful thing about the internet too. It allows you those deep dives.
Mhm.
So neither one, well, we didn't have the rights to the one on the left, and the
Mhm.
one on the right didn't seem like what the publisher wanted to put out there again. And what could we do that would still kind of mark this as a mid-century story? And we started talking about E.M. Forrester's book, A Passage to India, which has uh, a similar, I guess it follows a similar sort of colonial
Mhm.
story. And the publisher and I got really excited about this edition by a woman named Ellen Haskin, who is known more for her children's books. And we both just adored the elephant and this very spare use of color for the Union Jack, and cooked up this idea of an homage to that cover from 54, I believe,
Mhm.
around the same time as the two on the bottom, for what it's worth, and create a camel for the aunt, the protagonist in the story, Aunt Dot, to sit up top. And I asked Lindsay to make these really elongated um, camel legs for us so we can sit the type under her. and
Mhm.
and then again this really restrained use of color for a teacup. Just so we did, I remember Lindsay she added blue and red to Aunt Dot's scarf around the
Mhm.
hat, and we were both like, no, too much
No, take
color.
it out.
It was funny,
It
but
is
again,
fascinating though how
yeah,
different kind of trends come and go, and that there's a way that this looks so contemporary in the same way that the Forster version almost looks also quite contemporary, and
that's great.
the kind of adaptation of that into a new title, and using this kind of Turkish ornament like that
Yeah.
sense, you really get, I think, an interesting sense of the whimsy of the story, but also in a very contemporary looking visual way that also, I think, pays homage, I think, to the history or sort of the spirit of the story. So I think it's really fascinating. And you're right that we kind of chose it to kind of go along with the medieval image and the role of this like extremely intricate kind of ornamentation, and the visual echo of that was so lovely.
Yeah.
Almost entirely coincidental, but very lovely.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I think this conversation has illuminated some of these
Mhm.
parallels, I think, with the continuity of design and the way the power of design to really influence not just reading, but also understanding and return to a text.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think my final question for you is what's your favorite part about the book design process?
Oh, you didn't give me an
I was gonna
advance
ask
on
you
that one.
I was gonna ask you what's the most challenging part, but I think I'll end on a more what is your favorite part? Is probably the most challenging part as well, but what's your favorite aspect of approaching a new book, and getting to think of a new cover? What's your favorite part of that process?
Huh. Oh God, that's difficult, but I guess I'll go with what first popped to mind. So when I worked in house, I would say, and it's something that I definitely miss, being freelance for so many years now, and I knew I would miss it, which is the access to the editors,
Mhm,
to discuss the books with them after, a jacket meeting where they would tell a whole room full of people about each title. Then there was always an opportunity to meet with them separately and have a deeper conversation about the book and the expectations, and what had been done before, what we should avoid, what what purple not to use. So I really miss that because it was such a education.
mhm.
And I made a joke when I left to form my studio that, um, Sarah Crichton, if she's listening by some chance, thank you again for that amazing party. It One of the things I said was I kind of felt like I, had gone through an entire education from kindergarten to grad school
Mhm,
of, these 14 years of really digging in, and also, one of the fascinating things about book design, I think, is the you might get excited to design the jacket for a book you might actually not pick up in a bookstore as a reader.
mhm,
And that is a kind of a funny thing. So, it has a lot to do, of course, with the excitement of the editor and how they tell the story, or if maybe you're aware of the author and you're kind of curious because you've never had a chance to read them, and this is a great opportunity. But there is something about, for me, the investigative process, I guess, that I've
mhm.
talked about, and that kind of, when it requires it. And I do this with branding projects too, like a deeper historical dive to really understand, that it's not, I'm not just responding to what is on trend right now, but also, you know, decades and centuries and
Right.
millennia of graphic, imagery and communication, and a lot of it's subliminal for me too. But I like kind of building a storyboard for myself to understand that,
Mhm,
and then and then all of the discovery that comes with that. So, whether that's like looking for the right typeface so that it actually isn't just a font that I think is pretty, but actually is appropriate. We're
mhm.
looking at towers, and I wanted to obviously honor those camel legs with a really tall font. So,
Right.
and then it wanted to feel more geometric because that's what we were working with. Geometry is really what is makes this cover successful. So,
Mhm.
those small things all coming together, and really locking together is what makes a successful cover. And it took me a long time to get there, but
It takes all
yeah.
creatives a long time to get there, right?
But it's a joy when it
It
happens
is,
and
yeah.
it's great. So
Yeah.
yeah, I
Well,
hope that answers your
on
question.
that note, we've
Yeah,
gone a little over time, but I think this was such a fascinating conversation.
yeah,
Charlotte, thank you so much for
you're welcome.
sharing some of your book covers and
Of course.
a little bit about your creative process. And so fascinating, I think, to think about these links between medieval graphic design, contemporary graphic design. And so, thank you very much again for joining us. This was so fascinating.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Thank you so much. It was
And
such a pleasure.
Thank you. No, those of you still tuning in, join us for upcoming Getty programs. You can check the website for any upcoming programs, as well as this new one on Sunday, October 29th about Mercedes Durame. So join us again online soon. And Charlotte, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.